The best scene in the new Spider-Man film was probably the part where they're standing on the scaffolding, just sort of talking about what it's like to be Peter Parker. What made this really interesting is the natural dialogue that they were having. Everything was very naturalistic, and it flowed very well. But you gotta remember, Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man did not speak this way in their respective films. These characters lived in very, very dramatic universes, and the way they talk was much more heightened. Remember, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man was the one who said, "If you hit me, I'll bleed," and no one laughed, and no one commented on it later. But as an audience member, you don't question that. It makes sense. Everyone's talking that way, and the stakes of that story would suggest that you talk that way. It was a very dramatized franchise. But when you walked out of the theater that day, you knew if anyone started talking like that, they would be made fun of or ignored because the real world doesn't respond to dialogue like that. We don't think that way. And the stakes that we live through in our day to day life, the mundanity of life, challenges us to speak in different ways than characters do in film. And that's now how Tobey Maguire talks. So maybe the best line when they're standing on that building is when Andrew Garfield starts speaking very negatively about himself. And Tobey Maguire says something along the lines, "I want you to stop. You're amazing. I want you to let you know you're amazing." The fact that this same character, the one who said, "If you hit me, I'll bleed," this same guy was able to pick up on small, complex social cues, and he was able to interpret that Andrew Garfield's character was suffering from somewhat low self-esteem and that he could heighten that. He saw through that really benign comment of self-deprecation and sensed what he actually meant by that. It suggests a far more emotionally mature character than the one we saw at the end of Spider-Man 3. Because while Tobey Maguire's character did evolve through all three of those films, became more of a hero, he didn't become more of a sociable person. That's something that was, like, that's what the black suit arc kind of emphasized, that even when his personality changed, he wasn't any more socially complex, because that's not what the challenges in those films suggested. But we didn't go to the films for challenges like that. We went to those films to see the story of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. Same thing can be said for Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man. So now that we know they speak this way and they understand things like that, that must mean that once Spider-Man 3 ended, just like how we went out of that theater and went back to our regular day-to-day life, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man did the same thing, and so did Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. Now, Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man's a little different because it is suggested that there was a little bit more drama there, that he probably did live a heightened dramatic experience after that. The movie didn't completely end. But even in his circumstance, I could still see someone kind of going down a downward spiral, but in a more mundane way. The same way that, people in the real world go down downward spirals, like criminals do without living, dramatic, epic lives. They just kind of find themselves falling down that path. So to me, this goes into a much larger debate, which is what happens to characters after the movies end? And I think the polar opposite of what this film did would probably be the new Star Wars films. And I think that's why people feel so betrayed. Because what we learned in both Force Awakens and The Last Jedi is that Han, Luke, Leia, these characters continued to live very dramatic, tragic lives, suggesting that the arcs that they went through and what they learned in those films in the original trilogy wasn't actually enough to deal with the issues that universe needed them to deal with. And while some characters don't evolve enough to address the issues at hand at the end of their stories, take Tony Soprano, they at least have a heightened awareness of the issue itself. They've evolved to understand it, and that's the most important thing. But if he didn't have a greater understanding of it, then you feel robbed as an audience member. And I think the companies, they are not aware that audiences feel this way. They want you to feel like, oh yes, the world of Star Wars, that universe is constantly evolving, and you'll need to constantly go back in to have a greater understanding of the arc. But as an audience member, you just don't believe that's true. I think most audience members understand that the drama of that world should only be isolated to the film and backstories within the film, and things suggested within the film. It can't be information that's revealed after the film ends, or else you feel robbed. Now, you could argue that in the Spider-Man world, the multiverse was that piece of information that was withheld from the audience, and that later on, when it is shown, that, you could say, well, I watched the first 3 Spider-Man films. There was no suggestion that a multiverse was going to come and cause all these villains to come back. Clearly, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man couldn't sleep well at night because there was more tragedy out there. And I think you're right, but because it's such an absurd premise, we don't believe that character had to actively deal with that. That by the time a sequel came around, it's because an isolated thing happened out of the blue. It wasn't a continuous issue, which clearly, the conflict in Star Wars was something that just never ended. And these characters it was never addressed. So I want to go back to one other thing, and that's Shakespeare. Because I think Shakespeare also sort of set this precedent that heightened dialogue and was something that was isolated to the film and the art that we're seeing. Because if you go back to how Shakespeare's written, everything's written in poetic prose, and it doesn't make any sense because even though people back then spoke in kind of a, older tongue that made Shakespeare more accessible than it does now, no one really spoke that poetically. People don't think that way. But if this situation calls for you to speak that way, then it's more believable that you would. That's why I think this social contract between the artist and the consumer existed maybe since the dawn of storytelling. So it's an interesting idea. I'm really glad Spider-Man was aware that you could subvert this and that you could acknowledge this reality that we understand that the movie ends when the movie ends and build on it. Because it just felt so great knowing that these characters have continued to grow and evolve just like the rest of us.